The question becomes, when we think in terms of what the church should be, especially as we face the post-Christian and the postmodern context where we find ourselves today, the question becomes, what type of church? What should we be? And the challenge, I think, is for us to be a missional church, but it's a steep challenge. Say missional, I'm trying to draw a contrast between that and what we would call the institutional church, the church of Christendom. At its base, I would describe a missional church and say that it comes into being when a local discipleship community recognizes that it is God Himself who is on mission, and He is on mission in the world, and that He has in grace chosen to outwork this mission primarily, but not exclusively, through His local congregations. Now, there are implications from that statement. This means the church is not the goal of missions. This means the church is a witness to God's mission, a witness to what God is doing. And finally, all that a church does in a missional church is missions. Another way to say this is to say that if the only missions that a church does is its annual international mission offering for the denomination, or if it's some sort of mission work that's added to whatever else is going on within the church, that's a failure of missions. For it must be remembered that God's mission is nothing short than Jesus as the Christ, who is God's final and complete word of redemption for humanity. That is, in the mission of God, we as a missional church would witness to the fact that we ourselves have met this living Christ and found completion through the power that is in Him, the risen one. And that the world will also find that same power available to them, a power that gives life and a new way to live, if it will only turn to this God who is on mission. So it must be remembered that this Jesus, the living Christ, and Jesus alone is the calling of the church. That is the reason we have been sent on mission. And here's the kicker. How is a church to be missional without a thorough consideration of its surroundings? That is, its context. I mean, to assert that the church must preach the gospel, but then fail to understand what that gospel sounds like to the ears and the minds of those hearing it preached, is selfishness and really spells the doom for the gospel. So the question here is simple and challenging. How does the gospel we've been consistently preaching throughout Christendom, how does it sound to postmodern and post-Christian people? How does that gospel sound? How does Christendom's gospel sound? If a church would ever be brave enough to think through this idea, they would find themselves deeply challenged. Another way to think about this is to remind ourselves of Sally Morgenthaler's pungent statement. She said the culture is having a spiritual discussion and the church is not invited. And why aren't we invited? We're not invited partly because we've lost our ability to listen, and partly because the culture no longer thinks that we have anything to contribute to that discussion. In other words, they've heard it before. So here we are, the light of the world to proclaim, and we cannot get a hearing. What a tragedy.